Welcome to the second episode of our series on resilience, innovation, and the Alberta economy. This episode, Alberta's economic resilience and the effectiveness of the region's innovation ecosystems, will feature commentator Trevor Lewington from Southern Alberta. He's the Economic Development Officer in Lethbridge, with a rich perspective on matters of economic development. I'll be the host. And then Trevor and I will be discussing economic resilience and the ecosystem, drawing on the data and survey material which we've assembled, which we'll be sharing with you and asking to get you engaged in some of the discussion. But
thanks, Perry. Great to be with you again. Look forward to the questions for everybody in the discussion. My name is Trevor Lewington. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Economic Development Lethbridge, and I've previously served on the Board of Directors for Economic Developers Alberta. I'm the past president, so I'm officially part of what we deem to be the has-been club now. But certainly the regional innovation ecosystem is near and dear to my heart. It's a key part of the work that we do in this region, and of course, working with our provincial colleagues. So I look forward to the discussion.
Well, welcome, Trevor. Good to see you again. So let's bring the screen up. That's our introductory slide. So first topic, of course, is, what are we meaning by economic resilience, which was the focus of the survey, which has now been conducted since 2015. And when you go to GPT or look in a dictionary, you'll read that economic resilience refers to an economy's ability to recover from unexpected shocks like we suffer in Alberta with the price of oil or commodity prices in wheat, or disruptions, and maintain its essential functions. Such shocks can come in many forms, including natural disasters, financial crises, global pandemics, geopolitical instability. But to build economic resilience is important to help individuals, businesses, and communities weather these shocks and recover more quickly, minimizing the negative impact on the economy. Well, we asked in the survey of our KEI Network, in a survey that was conducted throughout April, what factors are the most sensitive measures of economic resilience? This is the survey data from April 2021, and I'll show you how it differs a little bit when it comes to April 2023. Clearly, the most sensitive measures of resilience have been job-related and corporate investment. All the rest pale by comparison. Maybe corporate bankruptcies are up there. But when you look at how there's been a change since 2021, in April of 2021, you see employment increasing or decreasing actually dropped by 24% as one of the measures of importance. Jobs themselves dropped to 48%, another drop of 16%. Personal bankruptcies dropped 16%. Corporate bankruptcies dropped 16%. But corporate investment increased by 8%. The sense is that the sensitivity of corporate measures as a measure of resilience has increased since 2021, probably because of recovery, meaning the economy now needs more capital and is less focused on unemployment issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things at play here. Post-pandemic, certainly, I think there's a greater acceptance of entrepreneurial opportunities. So, if you start your own business, that's not typically considered a, quote, job. And so that's sort of a traditional measure of employment. We've seen, Alberta is traditionally one of the most entrepreneurial provinces in the country. We have a much higher level of job creation through entrepreneurship. And so I think people define jobs differently now. We've got hybrid jobs. We've got just a different sense of what employment actually looks like. So perhaps that's driving a little less consideration there. I think we're also seeing, particularly post-pandemic, a drive towards automation, particularly, many of the manufacturers in my region looking at automating jobs that they can't recruit for. We've seen a massive increase in job vacancies, for example, across the whole province. So automation is driving that. There's simply not enough people to fill those vacancies today. My region specifically, there's over 6,000 job vacancies. Employers would fill those jobs tomorrow if there was a person willing to do them, or that was qualified to do them. So I think there's a lot of different things that are happening in employment. It makes it a much more murky number. And so perhaps that's why it's less important to people as a measure. Whereas corporate investment, the shiny new investments, the ribbon cuttings, those get a lot of press attention. Those are very front and center. Those are much easier to measure. And we've seen very significant investments in Alberta, particularly in the last 24 months, all across the province, whether it's the oil patch or aviation industry outside of Calgary. agri-food. And so I think those are top of mind for people. They're very visible in the news cycle. And so that's getting a lot more attention. That's just my perspective.
And that's a very good point. I think there is much more in the news about corporate investment, which would certainly elevate it as a relevant factor when we talk about the economy as a whole. So going on to the next, there were some other measures, and I just felt I'd make reference to them out of respect for people who contributed to the survey. Some have also cited the stable financial system as a relevant measure, the meeting of that financial system for meeting future needs. I've assumed that investment pretty well covered that. The sense that the relevance of corporate measures should be more specific to various industries. Citizens' perceptions, which is, of course, sentiment. Commercial rental market, vulnerability to economic shocks are also important factors. And resilience as an ability to adapt and self-repair, I think that's a given in the definition of resilience. And trends comparing other urban centers and investment as critical for creating opportunity, value, and wealth. So I think we pretty well covered it with the definitions that we've got, but there are some subtle differences in there. Now we begin to get into some graphics which require a bit of an explanation. That circle shows at the top a very economically resilient province, and the bottom not economically resilient at all. 3 is neutral. That red line is what we see in 2023, with the black line what we have in 2021. So you've seen some improvement. So the index, which is the average score that were among the respondents, increased from 2.68 to 2.85 for the province overall. We're paying attention to the left-hand side of that quadrant. So we've seen about a 6% increase in the view of economic resilience in the last 3 years. But an interesting and subtle distinction here is not the index itself, but to ask individuals whether or not they rated high or rated low, what proportion of respondents actually viewed the economy as resilient? Forget the index for a second, just what do the proportions look like? And this is interesting. It's pretty steady. What we saw in 2021 is rating the province as not resilient or somewhat not resilient was 49% of the respondents. This go around, it was 48%, almost the same. As for somewhat resilient or very resilient, it increased from 36% to 41%. But what I find fascinating here is the bipolar nature of this structure. You've got almost half viewing it as not resilient and another half viewing it as resilient. Clearly, we have a bipolar split, 2 different views of the same phenomenon. Why? What is contributing to this region? Is it a regional difference? Well, that's what we're going to see in a moment. But does this surprise you in any way, Trevor?
Yeah, not really. I mean, I think there is definitely a regional conversation, which I know you'll get to next. But I think if you poll any group of individuals, there's normally a split of people that are either fundamentally optimistic, like myself as an economic developer, always looking for the opportunity, and then there's folks that are perhaps, there was enormous amounts of people that were negatively impacted by the pandemic, as well as sort of the crunch with oil prices over the last couple of years, which has only really recently since been resolved with some global surges and other things. I think, again, if you're impacted by those events, you tend to take a more pessimistic view. But it is interesting to your point that it's almost a 50-50 split. I do think that's somewhat normal, but it is interesting.
Well, and there are other things to correlate besides the regional difference. We also have, as we noted in an earlier webinar, we have 2 parties in Alberta, one of which is quite positive about the economy, and the other one saying it needs significant help. So all of this splitting is creating interesting dynamics in how you assess the economy and what you might do to fix it. So the last few years, since 2015, I'm going to look here at the bigger picture, or the longer picture. Looking at the black line, if you can, that's the one that's the lower line of the 2, shows that economic resilience index over time. You can see it's gradually rising. There was a dip here, and there was a dip here, and a significant dip here. And each of those dips correlate with the dip in the price of oil. So economic resilience is strongly correlated, at least with our index measure, with the price of oil recovering slowly across 2015 to 2018, quickly since 2021, as did the price of oil after the steep COVID-related decline in 2020. So we've seen quite a rapid increase here, probably bringing it back to the level that we might have anticipated in the spring of 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder out loud, I don't know the answer to this, but it's perhaps part for the discussion later. You know, we've got these mixed signals. I think about the economy, we've got quote unquote unprecedented inflation that we're just, starting to moderate, but we haven't seen that for multiple decades. You've got the doom and gloom of raising interest rates and the highest levels of consumer debt. And yet the economy continues to create more jobs than it's ever created. So we've got these mixed signals. I wonder if some of it is sort of the perception of people are just confused around what's really happening out there. And, price of oil is a good example, although it's moderated somewhat, we had a massive surge coming out of the pandemic at the price of oil. Production's never been higher in Alberta. We're seeing record levels of production. And yet there isn't this overwhelming confidence in the industry or the future state because of climate change and sort of the play of renewables and sort of what's happening from a ESG or global perspective. So I wonder, to me, it's another one of those examples of mixed messages. And I think it's hard to decide, am I on the positive side or the negative side?
Well, you've cited how complex assessing an economy, particularly in this environment with so many of these, quote, forces and sources of change, global supply chain, inflation, new technologies, an aging population, the politics of express or don't express. I don't recall and I was born before 2015, I don't recall as many dynamics at play at any one time. And not necessarily negative, just chaotic.
Yeah.
That makes it difficult to invest. I mean, investors putting a lot of capital aside for a 20-year run at something want to feel a little bit more confident that something's stable, and nothing seems to be stable right now. When we look at 2013, which was not on the earlier graph, we see it's continued to rise, but ever so slowly. In other words, that rise from 2020 after COVID, we've seen the recovery, and that brought it up to the 2.85. So resilience continues to improve since 2015 in the province as a whole, a credit to whatever is contributing to economic diversification. But there is some concern, and we're going to see it as we move forward, that the recovery is uneven across regions. By the way, those yellow bars are simply citing break periods where we didn't do the survey in those years. Should we expect any difference in economic resilience between Alberta's regions?
Yeah, I think you absolutely should. The easiest example that I can think of is there are a number of communities in Alberta that are heavily dependent on revenues from oil and gas. Mm-hmm. And I can certainly show a graphic later that sort of highlights that. Lethbridge, my region in the Southwest, for example, has very few oil and gas assets. We're more concerned about commodity prices on the agriculture side. So, the lens in Brazeau County, which is the most dependent from a percent of revenues from oil and gas, is going to be very, very different to the rural county around Lethbridge, which is almost exclusively related to agriculture. So I think those differences are very natural. It's not just the split between Edmonton and Calgary or the perceived split between the two major centers, but you see that geographically across the whole province.
That really complicates governing, knowing where to invest, knowing what to invest in, very different dynamics. And now that should underscore that we have a very diverse province with very diverse issues and approaches for each. So if you're in charge of a province as a whole, you've got to really take regional factors into consideration, it seems to me, which means single policies aren't going to work. The policies need to be regional in focus. So here we are in April 2021, and there clearly was a difference between the three sectors. The Edmonton region was viewed as 30% resilient, or 30% of the respondents viewed it as resilient, whereas in Calgary, 48% viewed it as resilient, and the other regions was 42%. So of the three, the Edmonton region was the weakest, with only 30% viewing it as resilient, compared with Calgary at 48% and the other regions at 42%. But has it changed since 2021? Edmonton's improved from 30% to 36%, but still the weaker. Calgary's moved from 48 to neutral at 50%. Other regions also at 50%. So that's a positive. When we looked at the index itself, Edmonton's increased ever so slightly, about 1%. Calgary significantly from 2.76 up to 3.15. In other words, it's above neutral, and it's up 14%. I think we probably know why the mood or the sentiment in Calgary is more buoyant than it was 3 years ago. Calgary's the others declined to be the lower in the province at minus 10%. We'll reflect on that as well. So in summary, the economic recovery and resilience appears to be uneven between the regions, with the Calgary region now viewed as positive, with its ER index increasing 14%, and the Edmonton region's index up 6%, but still weak, and other regions as the weakest and further weakening since 2021. That may differ between northern, central, and southern Alberta, but we didn't have enough data to parse the other regions into their three different sectors. I'll be asking Trevor to elaborate a little with a little more color. I have gone as far as looking summary comments. We did ask the respondents not just to give us numbers, but to give us some commentary. And these are the highlights. Thank you to GPT. Overall, reliance on oil and gas hinders economic diversification. And we can all nod our heads to that or fall asleep. The comments highlight the challenges and the opportunities for diversifying this complex economy in the regions. In the Calgary region, the view is that a need for diversification further and less dependence on oil and gas obvious, but recognizing that natural resources provide stability to the economy, forestry, agriculture. In the Edmonton region, efforts have been made to diversify through the growth of other sectors, but government's still stuck on oil and gas, and there's a lack of private investment. This comes up over and over again, that the small, medium enterprises, the incubators, the small business innovators and entrepreneurs feel the lack of financing is contributing to their challenges. Other regions highlight the overall reliance on oil and gas, and you think about the Drayton Valleys of this world, the Fort McMurrays, maybe even the Medicine Hats, and the need for more comprehensive approaches to government for funding and ownership. Now, we didn't ask them, but over and over again, government comes in as a player. Overall, there's recognition of the need for diversification, but there are differing opinions on how to achieve it, on differing opinions on the role of government and on the pace of progress. I'm not going to read this, but there is considerable detail provided beyond those summary comments. And as I say, I'm not going to spend time today. It'll be in the recording, and you can review it then. Or if you want this, just ask me for the detail, and I'll send it over to you. But the overall comments are that we still have a dependence on fossil fuels, and that could be undermining the achievement of economic diversification. Trevor, you want to jump in here with any more color before we turn to the innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that the perception from other regions is more negative than 2021. So if we think about if employment's a proxy for public sentiment, the unemployment rate in Edmonton and Calgary last month was the same actually in both centers at 6.4%. And with the exception of one, every other region of the province had a lower unemployment rate. So all of those other regions, the employment situation, at least numerically, was actually better than Edmonton and Calgary. So it's interesting that there's a more negative perception of that.
Now remember, and this could be a factor, and I don't wish to undermine the relevance of the survey, but your interest in contributing to a survey may be biased by the fact that things are rough out there for you and for the company or the industry you're working in, and leading you to want to do the survey, whereas things are buoyant, you may ignore the survey. It may not be a helper for your situation.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's just interesting.
Okay, let's move on then. If I can bring this back up. Oh, I'm getting better at this. I think I am. I'm screen sharing. I should be able to do a shift now. So there we are. So shifting now to the innovation ecosystem itself. To achieve economic resilience, economies need an effective and continuous improving innovation ecosystem that supports the survival, growth, and retention of entrepreneurs and SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. This was a point made in the survey with the question, do you agree? In 2021, overall in the province, the index was 4.56. Remember, 5 is the top. So to get 4.56, you're going to have very few ones or zeros. In fact, I don't think we had a 1 in the bunch. 90% agreed that the province overall needed an innovation ecosystem and that it was relevant to diversification. In 2023, it was 4.43, still 90%. Edmonton went from 89 to 92, probably not a significant change. Calgary dropped a little bit from 93 to 88. Other remained at a low numbers, but 100%. There's some comments. Those that rated the the innovation ecosystem as most relevant said, there's no economic growth without innovation. And those that rated it weakly said resilience can be achieved in other ways. So you can get a sense of how people may have differed in their view, but overall, there's general agreement that an innovation ecosystem is essential to economic diversification. So very strong and consistent agreement that such a system is needed. When we did an overview, this just is further detail and elaborating on the point I just made that innovation is viewed as important for growth and entrepreneurship in all regions, but opinions do differ on whether it should be funded and controlled by the private sector or the government. There is a need for a level playing field for entrepreneurs. Regions prioritize energy and food security for resilience, and the impact of government policies and support for small businesses is crucial. But some are skeptical of government-funded research and misallocation of resources. Now, these were the comments that were made to that initial question. We didn't ask them to give this much color, but it was right there, right off the bat. When we asked them whether or not it was effective, that is beyond just the index itself, and we took the percentage of those that rated it as effective, 29% for the province overall, 23% for Edmonton, 45% for Calgary, almost double, and 25% in other. Now, remember, the earlier question was, is such a system needed? This is the rating of the system as it exists. So relatively weak. Only the Calgary's region's innovation ecosystem was viewed as effective at the 45% level with an index above 3. That's a 3.1. Edmonton is weak and other was weak. Now, other includes northern, southern, and central. And I might ask you here, Trevor, can you give us any color specific to southern and or central or northern Alberta in that you're working in the other regions?
Yeah, again, I think it's interesting in that there are 8 formal regional innovation networks or RINs across the province. And so it'd be interesting to get to the level of which RIN are you in to understand, is this a particular network that's being called out as less effective, or is it the system entirely? Randall also has added some color in the chat, but he talks about the fact that the ecosystem includes things like supportive infrastructure. I would argue that broadband is a significant barrier to the innovation ecosystem outside of the major centers, if that's not available, because a lot of the technology, a lot of the access to global markets, a lot of the web tools, even our friend ChatGPT that everyone talks about today, those are only effective and helpful if you can access them and use them in real time. So I think, to me, again, the ecosystem is one part of it, but there's the supportive infrastructure, there's the talent piece. Again, I don't think it's a surprise that more rural areas of the province perhaps are struggling with that.
Right.
It's a little bit easier for the major centers to attract the talent. They may be perceived at least as having the right infrastructure. It'd be interesting to break down other to more specific data around each of the RINs, but it definitely says we've got work to do, whether it's the formal ecosystem the government has established or the more generic version. Clearly there's an indication there's gaps, and that's the work ahead, is to figure out, both government and private sector, how do we raise up entrepreneurs in Alberta and be more competitive?
I think you've raised the point that we'll see shortly is significant as it relates to other, and that is within our urban environment, we have a lot of fairly sophisticated features of financing, of infrastructure as it relates to special accelerators, rural broadband, the presence of university research institutes. There's a lot of things you find in urban environments that are serving the creative appetites of entrepreneurs, and they're more generic or more general when we get out into rural areas. But let's look at whether or not the effectiveness itself has changed. Overall, that's on the right-hand side, you'll see that not a lot of change in effectiveness. It's still below what would be viewed as effective at 3. Some improvement from 2.69, but that's probably not all that significant. But were there differences between the regions? There appear to be. Alberta overall went from an index, as we noted, and effectiveness up slightly by 4%, and effectiveness in Edmonton up 9%, effectiveness in Calgary down 13%, and effectiveness in other up 25%. So while 50% in the rural areas viewed the innovation ecosystem as effective, it was up to 3.17. So it really has risen significantly, Trevor, among the other regions. It's still at well, at 3.5, it's higher than any of them. Only 1 in the 3 respondents, however, view the innovation ecosystem as effective. That's the 33, 32, 32. The other was at 50%. Significant improvement in other regions, and to some extent the Edmonton region. The effectiveness declined in the Calgary region, and we don't know why. And I don't really have someone working in the Calgary area. I do know that there has been a significant pullback in funding for the innovation ecosystem through Alberta Innovates, and that may be a contributor specific to Calgary. I can't be sure. The Calgary region, there was criticism of the innovation ecosystem in the comments, with some feeling that it was lacking focus and driven by political agendas, resulting in little support for small businesses. It's a very general comment, but there's probably something underneath it in detail. And I believe we have a more specific commentary on the next slide. In Edmonton, lack of support for disruptive startups and hyper-partisan politics again, stifling policies supporting innovation and small business growth. Alberta Innovates is criticized for its bureaucracy. And the other region, need for more comprehensive approach to government funding for innovation. Overall, need for a focus on small businesses, more forward-looking strategy is emphasized throughout the regions. But let's dig a little bit deeper on the rating of the elements themselves. What might be contributing to some of these ratings? We cited 4 elements: vision, resources, processes, infrastructure, and asked them to rate each of these for their in terms of the overall province or their regions, because we asked them a regional innovation system. Infrastructure was viewed as the most effective in the province. Vision and leadership and processes as the weakest, processes in particular. The human element, vision and processes, were the weaker. The concrete elements of resources and infrastructure were viewed as the most effective and positive. So all elements were rated as effective, above 3, with 76% citing infrastructure as most effective and with processes being the weakest. That wordsmithing was picked up in 2021. Let's see the changes, though. We went from 3.21 down to 2.71 in the index on vision, down to 3.14 in resources, down to 2.74 in processes, and down to 3.46 on the index for infrastructure. All of them dropped, 16% as low as and down to 3%. I cited the range here for a particular reason that's relevant to you, Trevor. The range on vision was about 16%, the range on resources 7%, the range 11% for but the range 23. And what that means is between the 3 regions, other, Edmonton, and Calgary, the low to high, there was a lot of variance around infrastructure. And that picks up on the point I think you're making, Trevor, that in the other regions, you've got a lot of variance on the availability of broadband, the availability of financing, the availability of research institutes, et cetera. There's a lot of variance in the innovations ecosystem outside of the urban areas. And I think that's what that one is picking up. And we'll see that later. As effective, the infrastructure is viewed as effective in all of the areas, processes, resources, vision, but the changes roll down. So broad decline in all elements of the innovation ecosystem, particularly processes and vision. So something seems to be going on of a lack of confidence or a lack of focus or a lack of actual output. While the infrastructure remains the most positive, it also has the greatest difference between the regions. And I think we've already discussed possibly why. As far as comments, the Calgary region emphasized the need for investment from government in small, purposeful innovations, providing ongoing support, reducing taxes and red tape, and allowing the current ecosystem to flourish without government intervention. The Edmonton region focused on innovation in healthcare, highlighting the need for government to prioritize expertise and chart a clear path for the future, producing products at a reasonable cost and establishing a centralized repository of innovation resources. A very creative insight or recommendation. The other regions cited innovation efforts as mainly driven by local communities, and there are concerns about the high dropout rate among children and the role of politics in shaping innovation policies. Overall, opinions differ on the role of government, as we see over and over again, in its role in promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, with some calling for consistent and purposeful support for small businesses in particular, and others suggesting that government intervention should be minimized to allow the current ecosystem to flourish. Demographic shifts and the growing number of new Canadians may also affect innovation efforts. And I think that item was very specific to Calgary. Do you want to bring in any more color here, Trevor? Your color earlier was very helpful, but is there anything further you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that Calgary has done a very good job of attracting, in particular, fintech, right? So working with financial institutions, investments. Edmonton has done, I think, a very good job, Tech Edmonton in particular, building around the healthcare ecosystem. So it's interesting that those pop out in the comments, but when you're developing technologies for the healthcare sector, you are predominantly going to be dealing with government funding and government funding mechanisms. Even though doctors' clinics are private enterprise, it is much more tied to government policy and government procurement because of the structure of how healthcare works in Alberta. Whereas Calgary has, again, fintech is much more private sector oriented. So I think just the nature of the focuses of the various ecosystems drives a little bit some of those perceptions. And I say that because we had a healthcare related company start up in Lethbridge, and we actually shipped them to Edmonton because they're far better suited in that ecosystem than here. There's far better supports in Edmonton than in Lethbridge. And so, each ecosystem has taken on some strengths and can really support, I think, companies differently. From an other perspective, all the other regions, I think the challenge around small business, as it says there, is programs have evolved a lot. So Alberta Innovates, as you pointed out, had funding cut in 2019, but even the government ministries that administer provincial programs have morphed and changed through elections and leadership contests. Federal departments overlap, municipal governments have different approaches. So if you're an entrepreneur, it's sometimes very challenging to know, who do I talk to? Which program do I access? And so some ecosystems do a good job of stitching those partners together in one spot with one interface. And in other parts of the province, I think we're less effective at connecting the entrepreneur to the right resource. And it can be very overwhelming and very confusing. And so that might be some of the data that falls out, in that people don't feel like there's support or they don't know how to access it.
A couple of points that I really wanted to emphasize that you just articulated. One of them is a credit. Is something that I'm delighted to see that an economic development officer or office saw an opportunity for a company in another region and was prepared to export it. So often we hear that it's all self-interest. It's driven by the municipal council that says, keep everything here. We're competing with others. We're not interested in sharing. We won't collaborate. Delighted to hear that, at least in your case, and hopefully in many others, that there is an interest in collaboration between the economic development interests in the province, so the province functions as a whole instead of a whole bunch of parts, particularly because, as you've made the point, it is a very confusing job to be involved in economic diversification and economic development. Very confusing, given the landscape of resources, the landscape of infrastructure, the different visions that emanate from political pundits, and the resources that are generally available, given interest rates, et cetera. I know the career I got into. I thought it was complex understanding how the brain functioned. Thank God I stayed out of economics, right? Or got into it late in my life. So next week, we will open up conversation, by the way, for the discussion, but let me focus for a moment on what's coming. We will be furthering in episode 3 a discussion on economic resilience and the ecosystem, but we'll be focused this time on Alberta's industries and professions, plus the roles for government, which is clearly we helped set up today in making Alberta more resilient. The commentator will be Brad Ferguson, with 1 S, not 2, former CEO of Economic Development Edmonton. I know Brad well. I think the network knows of Brad. We've had him on in other webinars, but he's intelligent, he's enthusiastic, he's well informed, and he's willing to be our commentator for next week. I have asked Trevor and I have asked Brad whether or not they would participate in the concluding webinar, which will be on April 25th, where we'll be discussing recommendations. I mean, up to this point, what we're discovering is chaos. What we hope to find is some way to make our way through this chaos with some recommendations that will be fitting, that are either regional or industry specific, or are worthy for the province as a whole. And one of the things that stands out slide after slide, discussion after discussion, is the confusion around what role government should have in economic diversification, and the fact that there is no economy in the world other than possibly Texas that has ever successfully regionalized an entire state or province. It appears to be you do this on a regional or municipal basis. Doing it on a provincial or national basis is proven to be almost impossible, although in the newsletter we cited, Dubai has taken on the effort and making considerable investment. So that's the wrap up for the data. From this point on, we'll get into even more sentiment. Any questions out there? Everybody's sort of darkened. Let's see some faces today. Trevor, you've got some slides. So do you want to give us any further color to any points that we've made today?
Sure. If I could, I'll just share and speak to the innovation ecosystem briefly, because I think there's a couple of nuances that are worth talking about. And I'm just going to find this here. So, and again, using Alberta Innovates' model just for consistency, I think is helpful. Hopefully you can all see that. And so they talk about, Alberta Innovates talks about in the innovation ecosystem, there's this journey, right? So it starts with ideation, it talks through conceptual development. There's also market validation, scaling, and establishing. And I would suggest, and I'm speaking perhaps for Southern Alberta, we do a fairly good job up to validation. We've got lots of supports. It's very much focused on, if you're familiar with TRLs or technology readiness levels, sort of 1 to 4, 1 to 5. I think for us locally, and again, I don't want to speak for the whole province, part of our gap is in particular scale up and growth, right? So we can get entrepreneurs established, we can get the tech established, we can get them the initial resources. There's a lot of funding for the startup phase, but there's this gap in the middle, both from an infrastructure and funding perspective, of taking those early successes and boosting them up and building them up in different ways. So I do think that's a potential factor that we have to think about as we look for solutions. Is the ecosystem is often designed to try and cover this whole process. We're not always brilliant at every step. And so where are the gaps, and where do we need to invest additional resources? And so again, for Southern Alberta, my belief is that that's particularly in the scale up and growth piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I would share with you is just this graphic, which I found helpful to talk a little bit about regional differences. And so, part of the reason some parts of the province are far more sensitive to changes in oil and gas is exactly this image, right? So if you're Brazeau County, 96% of revenues for the county are derived from oil and gas. And even in the top 20, even it's only half that number for the municipal district of Tabor. But in Lethbridge, where we have basically zero oil and gas assets, that number is lower still. So the sensitivity, yes, the province benefits as a whole, there's certainly a macro discussion, but the regional differences in that reliance, I think, are significant. And you can all, again, if you could overlay this map with some of those detailed results, I bet there's some correlation when you think about the price of oil in particular in these areas versus others, right? So just, again, a couple of things that I found that I thought were interesting.
It reinforces that in particular, that graph in particular, that Alberta is still suffering from what some call the Dutch disease. And that is the extent to which the oil and gas industry has infiltrated the economies, making them somewhat dependent. And I think about a community like Drayton Valley, where oil and gas exploration is fundamental. And when oil and gas prices went down, the trucks and the rigs were all sitting in vacant or in parking mode. And yet when things are buoyant, the VLTs are running strong, the restaurants are running strong, the motels are filled, everything is happening, it's alive. But when it's not, it's down. And until it diversifies. But the point I want to lead to is unless the province was just one industry, which is clearly not anymore, it's very difficult to say that there could be a policy, an economic policy that would be fitting for all. So if there's any recommendation that may emerge from this series, it's the sensitivity of making certain that policies at a provincial level take into consideration regional and or as local differences, in which case they're probably going to be more general policy than specific targeting of a tax break for this industry or a tax break. It's got to be generic in nature. Trevor, have any recommendations emerged as a byproduct of what you've just been witnessing today, or that are core to where the economic developers of Alberta are coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alberta Innovates, when it works with the 8 regional innovation networks, does a good job of allowing each network to come up with a business plan. So we each provide a 3-year proposal, which Alberta Innovates funds to some level. But although there are provincial priorities, each region is allowed to adapt their specific services and their specific RIN in terms of what they're going to offer for entrepreneurs by region. So I think the province does a reasonably good job of there's a model of where they allow that flexibility by region for solutions. So the more we can do that, or how we can replicate that model across other things, I think that's a good thing. In recent years, we've seen some of the accelerators centralized. So the province made a point of investing heavily in 5 major accelerators, but they were largely only offered in Edmonton and Calgary. And if you wind back the videotape, 5 years ago, there were much more decentralized offerings and opportunities for rural and sort of remote access to those programs. And so I think that's actually a step backwards, personally. I think that, we need to remember that, yes, a third is in Calgary, a third is in Edmonton, but there's a third in the rest of the place that we fill up the geography with. And so how do we ensure equitable access? And that doesn't, it's not impossible for an entrepreneur, for example, in Lethbridge to drive 2 hours to Calgary. But let's recognize that additional 4 hours of commuting time is an incremental burden and time out of their business. So how do we bring that content through technology, other means, back to the entrepreneur and make it easy, right? So certainly I think we've seen some good examples of where policies allow for regional adaptation. And we've seen some examples recently where centralization, perhaps under the auspices of efficiency and best value for the taxpayer, is not always in the best interest of the people trying to use the system.
Interesting. I mean, it just underscores further how chaotic and how important it is to understand these local issues in order to craft, if you want to even craft policy. Some say, just let the economy do what the economy will do and stay the hell out of it, because you're not going to get it right. It's too complex. But government being government and seeking votes from citizens who pay taxes, they want to make a difference. They want to make a contribution. They try hard, but getting it right, boy, what one hell of a challenge. And I'm not sure how well informed the voter is to take issues of economics into consideration when they go to the ballot box. And yet, over and over again, we hear that the economy is fundamental for financing our welfare state and our health and education. So understanding the economy and making the right decisions seems core to a healthy economy and to a functioning, informed democracy.
Well, and again, you talk about making the right decision at the ballot box, but which ballot box? The federal government plays a role, the provincial government plays a role, municipal governments play a role, and so it's again aligning a lot of those different players. Again, to give credit, Prairies Can, which is a federal regional economic agency, has opened service centers across the province and other communities. Their team used to be based just in Edmonton and Calgary. They've opened regional service centers across the province. So, allowing better access to federal programming that they offer, which has enormous value. And again, I think the more we can drive policy coordination and collaboration across governments, that is also very powerful. I see Randall has his hand up, just so you know, Perry.
Okay, Randall, your turn.
Yes, thanks. I guess for full disclosure, I worked with Western Economic Diversification for 14 years and retired a couple years ago, the precursor to Prairies Can. And I have since been involved with the Wayfinders Business Cooperative, but very involved with the Edmonton RIN as a general member. So I've been following it since it formed, kind of out of the ashes of the old Edmonton Economic Development Corporation. So my observation is that we do need a more centralized collective intelligence operating here. Even when I was with WD, the concept of a business ecosystem was relatively recent, and everybody pointed to Silicon Valley as the model, and then around Boston and so on, especially for technology ecosystems and innovation. Borrowed a lot from the rainforest concept that came out of Silicon Valley, but I've been studying now how nobody should have ownership of a ecosystem, but there is the political partisanship and tug of wars for people wanting to own pieces of that ecosystem and claim ownership and so on, governments, but also corporations. And I would like to see more of, I'm actually proposing to the Edmonton RIN a think tank that starts off with a charrette of people who are interested in adopting a more systems and design thinking approach to innovation ecosystem optimization. It's not simple, but there are models out there such as systems dynamics that could be adopted that could perhaps give us some insights as to where are the gaps and duplications in the current ecosystem? Where are the points of high leverage where a small intervention can make a huge difference in performance? And so actually I'm putting open an invitation to anyone who's interested to let me know. But I really do believe that we need to kind of build in a kind of a collective intelligence there where nobody has ownership or even a huge stake in this. It's a system that is representative of all the interests.
That's isn't that what business councils are? Isn't that what if there's a Department of Economic Development at provincial level, it would say we have a central role to get policies right, and as such, getting some credit for doing good and great things. But the difference between fixing an economy and fixing a business, I mean, a business is not the economy. The economy moves slowly and transitions at a snail's pace. Businesses live and die based on events that are momentary.
Well, I think we all need to really understand the nature of a business ecosystem, that it is distributed. It's more of a network than a hierarchy. I know if you look at Soviet Union or China, the systems that they built, very centralized, very hierarchical, didn't work very well. I think it's partly based on our own human nature, that we are more independent than some would like to give us credit for. And we're at our best when we're plugged in, using our potentials in ways that leverage highest value. But so I've been looking at the nature of network theory and hierarchy theory, and looking at the shape of an ecosystem. It's a combination, but it's more of an network of hierarchies than a hierarchy of ecosystems. There are some business models out there, like the viable systems model by Stafford Beer, that he developed back in the 80s and 90s, that still hasn't been fully exploited. And I'd like to see us give that a shot, see what we can do with it.
Excellent point. Trevor, you want to elaborate, comment, reinforce, or otherwise?
Yeah, no, thanks, Randall. I think it's a great perspective. I mean, as you pointed out, an ecosystem is exactly that. It's a dynamic, almost organism-like structure.
Yes.
No one owns it. No one controls it. The rainforest and some of the tools that came out of that process, I think, are helpful. Again, there's sometimes a sentiment in the business community that government is the enemy. Government's job, in my humble opinion, is to bend the river so people can fish in it, and there ought to be regulation and oversight. And businesses do act in self-interest, which is not always a collective interest. So there's a balance there, I reject the notion that it's one or the other, which Perry, I sometimes think comes out of some of these surveys, right? That it's no government or all government. It's not that simple. But an ecosystem has to be fed, right? There needs to be a balance. And if you think about an actual rainforest, there are programs, there are critters that die that provide nutrients for new things to give birth. And sometimes we get hung up on, because it was a best practice 5 years ago, that we have to hang on to that. It may no longer be applicable to the current need and to the current system. And so it's that continual development and recycling and what overlapping that happens in an actual ecosystem that we need to try and replicate and make it more dynamic to respond to what's actually happening in the business or in the community.
Almost reminds me of Newtonian versus quantum physics. That quantum physics, we never are quite sure about anything. So it's always probabilistic, whereas we love in politics for it to be linear and deterministic, and all we need to do is X and throw more of X at it and all would be well. And there seem to be some that feel if you just throw money at it, it's going to fix it. And I think what we're hearing is it's much, much more complex as an organism than that.
Yeah, I'd like to add that back in the 60s, one of the systems thinkers, you may have heard of him, Herbert Simon, won a Nobel Prize for some of his work related to organizational systems. And one key concept was satisficing, which in other words is subsystem or sub-optimization. That is that not everybody in the system gets everything that they want. It's optimized overall as a total system, but that means that many of the competing businesses in the ecosystem are sub-optimized for themselves, but it's optimized. Their performance in the overall system is optimized. And so what I'm saying is that there are models that help us to come up with a system that is going to be best for everybody, in a way.
Well, one of those systems is called interest rates, which applies and everybody feels them. We've certainly seen attempts to mediate employment and mediate investment by manipulating interest rates, and nobody really feels we got it right yet. Keynes, for all of the things that seem to be he's credited for, is now being subject to severe criticism, although I gather Keynes did say there was a point in time when government needed to stop and to pull back. But this manipulative interest rates that touches everybody doesn't seem to have been the quote, the answer that some feel or wish as economists it would be. And, whether it be tax levels or whether it be red tape, we've talked about how complex the quote, well, if there is a system, I mean, that's mankind's word, but if there is an economy and a system to support that called innovation, Alberta's trying very hard to get it right. There's even questions of the good things that Alberta innovates. Somebody obviously feels with the cutbacks that it obviously wasn't doing right or wasn't compliant with some political view. And we've seen in numerous comments of, could we keep politics out of economics? Some think it should be done by the forces of business itself. Has immigration affected your region?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a massive change in the proportions. So last year, Lethbridge had about 2,500 newcomers come to the community, and half of that number was through international immigration. So, that's a much more significant proportion than has historically been the case. Our region resettled, for example, a number of Syrian refugees a number of years ago. We're home to Canada's largest Bhutanese community, for example, as a result of settling refugees at that time. So, that's not something you associate with Lethbridge or Southern Alberta, but we have become a bit of a hub for not only resettlement, but also for international immigration. And to Bill's point, that we have an aging workforce globally in Canada, in Alberta as well. We have challenges finding people that want to fill jobs, but we also have, this enormous untapped resource of, globally educated folks with great life experiences and educations and skills that we can add to the local dynamic, which I think is amazing. And so we're starting to see how that plays out, and we see that reflected in local businesses.
Well, it's certainly, immigration is certainly part of economic policy when it comes to the aging population, when it comes to questions of productivity. I mean, we see both technology and immigration playing a role. We've certainly talked about AI and its positive implications and also its negative implications on the future of jobs. But immigration seems to have the capability of muting some of the shocks that we would otherwise have as a byproduct of aging, so we can continue on a growth trajectory.
The only challenge for Canada, I think, is the fact that everyone is competing for that immigration. There's a global demand for talent. And so, again, coming back to government policy, which, as we're seeing, is linked to provincial employment strategies and federal immigration strategies, are we making it easy for the right talent to come into our country? Do we provide the right supports? Because there are many other countries competing for that same talent.
Well, and knowing what is the right support based on who's coming forward, whether or not we have the institutional infrastructure to receive them and to settle them and to get them into a productive capacity where they are enjoying the benefits and not simply sucking up the benefits, which there are some politics that feel immigration has a negative impact on our society, but those in economics feel it's a major contributor. It's a consumer and it's a producer. And it's an innovator. I'm first generation immigrant. My wife's first generation immigrant. I think characteristic of early immigrants is their insecurity and their wish to build networks and to get engaged and to be part of a society. They're in a rush where others are more settled.
Yeah, fascinating. I think the one of the things you've talked a fair length about is chaos, and out of chaos, I think, comes creativity, and I think that's one of the things that is a process and is messy. We're not going to see creativity often put into an easy metrics because, of course, the dynamics of it. So that's one of the positive things that I see happening in even in the development of resettlement. We look at, I've been involved with ESL for a number of years now, and looking at the incredible amount of talent and ability in that, and the challenges we have in how to move from, I would say, racially homogenous environments, which are actually necessary in a way to move to the next one. There's a chaos in that comes from, and I'm not sure what the ecosystem, are you meaning economy and ecology, and ecological, is that what you're meaning by the ecosystem? Because I think that's part of it as well, is there's many blendings right now of the different influences, and we've talked about ChatGPT, but the fourth industrial revolution itself, as we look at how do we bring people from a different culture into our environment, their ability to innovate and respond to depends a lot on their exposure to the opportunities that are there to be able to both partake of, but also participate in and provide for. So it's been a wonderful examination of what's going on here. I think regionalism again is a very, very critical issue as we look at some of the other ways that the homogeny or the top-down or unipolar approaches are being foisted. And you know, I'm not a great fan of the just transition and that sort of top-down thing that says everybody does the same thing. I think there is a necessity to have that awareness and the freedom to be able to express that, articulate that, and engage in that in a way that may be a little messy, but certainly I hold a lot of hope for Alberta.
Well, one of the features of Alberta that creates mess is the disruptions that we've had with oil and gas. And some are of the view that without a crisis, you don't get change. Well, the dynamism of our economy is to some extent driven by its vulnerability and the lack of diversification, which brings with it, and I'm sure every economic development officer knows it, the need to think differently, the need to open up, the need to research, the need to keep your mind wide open for where is there opportunities instead of just resting on codfish or on forestry or on whatever until such time as it disappears. So there is a need for balance. We're never going to get it right, and hopefully we don't get it right, because that would imply some type of either of a socialistic or a steady state. I think economies in a steady state are probably the ones that are most vulnerable. So a little bit of chaos. Was it Drucker that said, if it ain't broke, break it? I think he was reinforcing the importance of innovation and ongoing creativity and the value of continuous learning. Am I getting it right, Trevor?
The other book title that I'm fond of is, you know, Sacred Cows Make the Best Hamburgers. You know, so sometimes you have to be a little creative.
Yeah. So disorder. You know, we vote wanting stability, but we don't want so much of it that we're setting ourselves up to die or to become vulnerable. So to get it right is to allow a significant or a certain amount of tension and uncertainty in an environment to foster innovation. I mean, we have research universities. These are one of the elements that we drop into the middle of a society that's supposed to be a bit disruptive because it looks at the future, it looks at technology, it looks at students and the socio-demographics, and it creates just the right ingredient of what that community needs if it's thinking about that community or that region. If the research university is in fact part of the community or just a publisher parish instrument. You've got a thriving university at Lethbridge. You've got in Olds, we've got a great agricultural college. The history of the research university in agriculture is astounding. It helped build the agricultural phenomenon, the agricultural industry that makes Alberta what it is. So our universities and colleges have played a significant role. Is the economy moving too fast for them in the world that we know today? I think the universities have become a bit of a problem. I think they have become self-serving. The bridges between the university, the community, the economy, the province need to be built. I think we've built great universities, but we haven't necessarily integrated them well enough, other than the graduates who often have to leave because they are overeducated for our economy. There's a dynamic between a research university and our economy that I think needs some attention.
This is one of the conversations I had with the Minister of Advanced Education pre-election while he was here, is that Alberta Advanced Ed has put forward a strategy for innovation in post-secondary. And there's a lot of linkage to industry and there's a shift going on there. And my question to him was, great, how does that link to the strategy that the other department through Alberta Innovates has? Because you both define innovation differently. And there was no real answer, right? So, you know, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that we're giving institutions different mandates that don't always align, and that adds to the complexity and to the chaos. And the other piece is that in most recent times, we've cut back post-secondary investment by, in some cases, 20% to a single institution. That will inevitably cause ripples and changes, not only structurally, but in terms of what they can offer and how in tune or how fast they can move, right? So there are a number of other things that are affecting that, and some of it's as simple as government policy. And what exactly do you want to be the outcome of the system? Is that aligned with what the business community needs? And does that match even other parts of the government system in terms of priorities, areas of focus, and those kind of things? And we've seen that sort of mismatch. And I think, if you look to San Antonio as an example of a Texas community that's done a great job, I would argue that when you visit that community and you talk to civic leaders, business leaders, educational leaders, they are all very much singing the same song. They're all crystal clear on what some of the key issues are, and they seem to be working much more in the same direction collectively than perhaps Alberta is at this time.
That's a really interesting point, because I've seen some shifts in our urban environment to becoming much more savvy about the relevance of innovation, of thinking outside the box of their own vote, of what role a councillor, what role an MLA, what role an MP should be playing, to be thinking bigger than the bridge for their local town. And I think that big thinking and that understanding of the economy, we need an awakening if we're going to make progress in continuing to diversify the province that appears to be in everybody's interest. I think we need an education. We need a more informed government. We need one appreciating the regional differences. And I've got to say, if you're symptomatic of what economic development officers are, Trevor, I'm hopeful.
30 years ago, I was for a short while a local economic development officer, and I studied that at Waterloo and so on. But it's been this ongoing struggle to get our politicians to stop the smokestack chasing and to look at growth from within. I'm just wondering, since I haven't been that involved with local community economic development, has there been a ground shift, or is this an ongoing struggle? How is the battle going?
That's a great question, Randall. I'm again always optimistic. I think that comes with the profession. But if I look to the most recent conference, so every year Economic Developers of Alberta hosts a conference. We have about 450 people. We get together, and this last go around, about half the registrants were economic development professionals from across the province, and the other, I would say almost half, was in fact elected politicians from across the province, and a lot of municipal councillors and mayors. And so we offer a course, for example, economic development for elected officials, which has seen increasing registrations. So there are some communities that are very proactive at looking and sort of better understanding the political level and the role they play in economic development. And to your point, it's one of the things we talk about. There's many studies that back this up, but a new greenfield relocation, a smokestack, a new smokestack, only accounts for 1 out of 100 every new jobs in the economy, right?
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's 55 coming from supporting existing business, and roughly 44 out of 100 coming from new startups. So yeah, the one is important because you get to cut ribbons. It's very sexy economic development, but in terms of impact, it matters the least. And so I think governments understand there's a need for investment attraction, but you need to support entrepreneurs and innovation from a startup perspective, but there needs to be programs from a business retention and expansion. And that's, to me, that business retention and expansion, that scale up and growth, is where all levels of government do the least amount of work, and yet it can be the most impactful. So to your point, it's better, I think. I've seen an arc over the last 10 years or so of improvement, but there's still far more to do because, again, that's where the most activity happens.
Well, as an economy matures and things become more complex, it would seem to me, as an observer, that you need to move economic development a little bit further away to give it a little more independence than being whiplashed by politics.
And again, there are different models for this. So my organization is an arm's length, not-for-profit society. Mm-hmm. So we receive about 35% of our funding from the municipality, the city of Lethbridge. But I have an independent board of directors, which includes some elected officials, but we operate outside of the municipality. And once our business plan is approved and our budget is approved, we don't really answer back to the city in a formal way. We do what we think is right based on the leadership of the community, which is reflected on our board. That's a very similar structure to Calgary, for example. Edmonton Global, although it's focused primarily on investment attraction, is arm's length. So you see that model exists throughout the province, but there are many very successful municipal departments that do economic development as well. But I think, to your point, Perry, I think that's exactly why the government spun out Invest Alberta. That was very much the intent of creating a crown corporation targeting investment attraction that was arm's length, that was not a government department. And we can argue about the merits of whether or not they were successful, but I do think pushing it further away to be independent of policy and the whiplash component was certainly part of the reason the province chose that approach.
Well, I can make this comment because there are others that wouldn't or couldn't. There have been ongoing tension between Alberta Innovates and economic development as to who has influence on the economy. Alberta Innovates is supposed to be sufficiently arm length that its regional, its rims and all of what it does is in fact reflective of not centralized thinking, but sort of bottom up.
Plus, and Trevor had brought out a point about global competition for a talent pool, sort of like a raid for brains. And that has been building for a long time. And maybe we're coming to a very important point for that. But my question would be more specifically on competitiveness of the economy, because you're talking about innovation, that role has been talked about a lot. But are there opportunities coming up because of rebalancing globally? And one example that's I've been watching since last, I think, summer, it caught me a bit by surprise, but everybody uses Japan as the penultimate example of an inverted demographic pyramid. But Buffett was widely enthusiastic, and since then it's not doing bad. I mean, the policies are a bit extreme for most countries, but I wonder if we always assume that it's in a bad situation and will never get better because they're still going to have pressure in the future. And meanwhile, they've learned how to accommodate that. And in the meantime, China, Southeast Asia, other countries are becoming more expensive, standards of living rising and stuff like that, and pressure from some even lower cost areas in some cases. So are there any opportunities that might come up for Alberta, or we might not be the most competitive in the world, but relatively speaking, we may be a lot better than 10 years ago, that our standards of living aren't quite as out of whack with the rest of the world we're competing against? You know, and robots and farming are a good example where innovation could change that equation quite a bit, where the other countries may not be able to pick up on that as quickly. But it's just that you don't hear much about competitiveness in discussions. And I think that's one of the problems we have in this society. People don't care. I mean, has there been much talking or an issue around competitiveness and how the landscape may have changed, and there may be more opportunities for us going into the future that we would have ignored in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I do think competitiveness is always an issue. Canada has historically ranked very low in terms of labor productivity compared to other, in particular G7 countries, right? That we are, in terms of unit output, where we require far more inputs than we should. So it is a global race. It is.
Since I have you there and we're on this topic, maybe you can answer a question that's always been in the back of my mind, and that is the economy of Canada is very much based on resources. That's an extraction process.
Yep.
It's not necessarily labor intensive. Does that not have a bearing on your productivity index?
It can, but I think, you know, back to Bill's question around what's the opportunity, creating more of those value-added jobs here is what's key, right? Leveraging the strengths and innovation that we have. And, you know, if I use food as an example, we have a growing global population that's hungry for the things that we make. We have, at least to present, Canada has a very good reputation for food safety and food quality. You know, if you put a Canadian flag on that package, it's going to sell above many other products that are on the shelf elsewhere in the world. And so how do we do more of that transformation here? How do we do more of that in an economy where we have good jobs, good environmental regulation, good health and safety standards, and leverage that reputation, leverage those commodities, but actually add the value and create that value here?
Okay, that's a tough one. When I was managing partner with KPMG Consulting, I asked leaders in forestry and in agriculture and in energy to come to my office because we wanted to build a diversification practice. And what I got back is we do not control our assets. They're controlled by US companies that want raw product. They don't want product. If you start messing up a 2x4, you're going to have trouble from your corporate owner. So that implies that we don't have ownership over our resources, that we will continue to be a shipper of raw product. I'm not negative at all. I mean, God, I wouldn't have stayed here for the number of years if I didn't have incredible optimism and thrilled with what we have here in Alberta and in Canada in general. But that shocked me. And it shocked me to the point that I said, you're a little naive, aren't you, about what this economy is really made of? So tell me it's changing, or it's changed, or it will change, Trevor.
Well, I have to believe that it is changing and will change. And I think COVID was a big help for that, right? We've realized that stretched global supply chains are not necessarily reliable, and we can't afford 2 and 3 week, so friendshoring, reshoring, whatever you want to call it this week. I think that trend of bringing things closer to the markets where they're needed has been accelerated. So let's build on that. And I think there's an opportunity to showcase Canadian ingenuity and Canadian innovation and disrupt some of those traditional industries and maybe knock those companies off their X and show them how it should be done. And all of a sudden, there'll be a whole different thought process.
Put a skirt on and become a cheerleader. I think that's bang on. I mean,
pom-poms here somewhere.
If there's any message that may well come out of this series that would reinforce the relevance of value added, we've got the most extensive pipelines to feed the US. We've got distribution systems, shipping, airlines, rail, you name it, to move things out of here as opposed to producing them. But if the market values them as higher quality, that's one thing. But we've got to fix our transportation costs and our distance from market. That's not easily done. So there are challenges that are inherent in our location and issues of productivity that we've got to figure out how to beat. And maybe AI and infotech that are distance irrelevant because everything moves over wires. Maybe it's in that economy that we will find some sizzle that will enable us to be more productive.
There's a whole series of webinars on trade infrastructure and trade policy. So let's queue those up for the next season.
Well, we're going to see next week in the discussion on roles for government that negotiating trade agreements is a fundamental role of government. And hopefully we underscore that is not our sole focus of trading, that we are focused on producing and trading what we've produced, not just what we ship and extract.